Hi, it's been a while, and I'm back to talk about Dungeons and Dragons. Or more specifically, this tweet about Dungeons and Dragons, saying that disabled people shouldn't be represented in all fantasy settings. This was posted in response to a post championing the increased visibility and use of combat wheelchairs in Dungeons and Dragons. And I have a couple of things that are important to note here. First of all, Dungeons and Dragons and most of fantasy are not real depictions of medieval society. They just aren't. It doesn't even really matter how dedicated your games master is to an authentic representation of medieval society. Most video games, most TV shows, anime that seem to be based in some kind of medieval setting, they're all heroic settings, mythological settings. They're not real depictions of medieval society. So when this guy is talking about the theme of the settings that he's playing in, he's not talking about the Dark Ages. He's talking about these grimdark fantasies. And time again, in response to criticism of this tweet, he brought up Berserk, the manga and anime, as if it was an actual thematic depiction of Dark Age society instead of what it actually is, a fantasy world. One where all kinds of bizarre magics and physically impossible acts happen on a page-by-page basis, where people are capable of doing things that are simply impossible, where people live in ways which are in no way representative of Dark Age society, and all kinds of anachronistic and even impossible technology is part of the setting. The sword Guts wields in Berserk, the trademark symbol of the entire series, is an impossible weapon. And it shows a limited mindset of who your world should include and who it should appeal to, that an impossible weapon should be a trademark of an entire series and its protagonist. But the concept of that weapon being something that enables someone with a disability to be part of the setting is completely alien. The only thing that can be included is a weapon that he specifically associates with. And my second point is this: if you are a games master and you are trying to establish a game world which your players are in, which is a representation of grimdark, Dark Age society, you're not playing Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons is, for pretty much everyone involved, a power fantasy. It involves your players increasing in their powers and abilities from their base level, which is already almost superhuman, to godlike status. The things your characters can do, the things they can survive, do from very early in any campaign become so wildly detached from any kind of reality that it is impossible to crowbar Dungeons and Dragons and its progression system into a grimdark, dark fantasy, authentic representation of the past. It is just a power fantasy game, and that is fine. Dungeons and Dragons does that very well, as do many of the other systems around it, which are just like it, like Tales of the Valiant from Kobold Games, like Pathfinder. These are all games that are very similar in the way that they work, in part because it's what people are used to, but in part because it is a successful power fantasy mechanic. And that is the framework by which people enjoy playing the game. They're enjoying it because they get to spend time with their friends. They're enjoying it because they get to go on adventures together. They get to role play as characters. And because the entire structure of the game mechanics of those systems is a power fantasy. And if you are limiting that power fantasy artificially by saying that impossible spells and weapons, impossible to survive circumstances being survived, is part of the power fantasy, but your players not being able to play in a wheelchair is not, then your artificial lines of who gets to be included and who gets to be seen in your setting have been specifically designed to exclude. There is no theme that you are being loyal to because you've already picked Dungeons and Dragons, a power fantasy, as the framework that everyone is playing in. And you have declared that that power fantasy is an invalid choice for someone who has a disability and wants to be seen in the game. That the power fantasy is just for you and people like you. And I generally try and steer clear of saying that people are bad games masters for mechanical reasons, for rules reasons, because everyone likes different ways that they approach mechanics and rules. People are bad games masters generally because of their personalities and the way they treat other people. This is a rare case where those two become the same thing. If a games master is excluding a player from the power fantasy everyone else gets to play together, specifically because their way of being seen in the game as themselves is invalid, when everyone else can do what they want. They can play as literally angels. They can play as humans who are descended from dragons, but they can't be in a wheelchair? You're a bad games master. You're a bad person. And I do not make that judgment lightly. Now, if someone actually is interested in running a game with players which takes an authentic representation of the Dark Ages seriously, then you don't pick Dungeons and Dragons or any game like it. You don't even pick more grimdark systems like Symbaroum, for instance. The fantasy and the magic is too baked into how these games work to make it possible, even slightly, to really depict what it would be like to live in the 800s. And I am willing to bet that the number of people who are actually interested in playing a role-playing game with their friends in which they actually live as people in the 800s and try and scramble through that society in a real, authentic depiction of that, the number of people actually interested in doing that around a table with some friends is tiny. You would be extraordinarily lucky ever to find the incredibly niche number of people who want to do that with you. Which is why I'm convinced that this guy, who falls back on Berserk and Warhammer 40k as his touchstones of authentic grimdark realities, has no interest in actually ever doing that. No, what he specifically has an issue with is people getting to enjoy a power fantasy which is not his power fantasy. And the answer to that problem is simple. Don't play with other people. Enjoy your mangas, enjoy your anime, enjoy your video games on your own. Because it's clear that your wants and needs are the only thing you have any interest in, and those of other people are simply irrelevant to you. And as long as that is someone's attitude, they are not ready to play the kind of cooperative, collaborative storytelling that shared tabletop role-playing games are, where we champion and celebrate each other's experiences, what we're all bringing to the table, how all of us can help build a story together. Where being seen and represented in this joint fantasy world is a joy. Because that's what this is all about. That's what we're playing in, a fantasy. And if a combat wheelchair is a step too far, but a literally physically impossible to wield sword isn't, maybe you need to think about what fantasies are and whether other people's fantasies have any place in a world alongside yours.